Alright YouTube, it's time to talk about the occult again. Occult video 4 on plague technology. It might as well just be on the plague in general. I think it's fitting considering the Ebola epidemic that's currently ravaging the world. Something to keep in mind. Another plague that we have to deal with potentially. But I wanted to talk about several aspects of the plague. It's a bacteria, not a virus, so it is affected somewhat by antimicrobials, and that features in heavily with what I'm going to talk about. Of course, the Black Death, most likely from plague, Yersinia pestis, appears to have been a strain that more often went pneumonic. That's why it spread more quickly. That's why its death toll would have been higher than regular bubonic plague. Some of the things that were being used to combat the plague at the time, I believe, could have been at least mildly effective at preventing transmission and death, and potentially treating people and preventing them from getting sick in the first place, or at least getting others sick. One would be the herbalism at the time. We've all heard the sort of children's rhyme, ring around the rosy, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. In the line about posies in your pockets, what they are talking about, this is a children's sort of nursery rhyme. It's actually based on the Black Death, which is rather morbid, and a lot of nursery rhymes are. I should probably cover that in a future video. You'd be surprised what weird shit that's actually about. People were taking certain scented herbs because they believed in miasmatic theory, and I'll explain what that is. And they would put them in their pockets, they would put them in rags and hold them over their mouths, thus filtering the air that they were breathing, possibly reducing transmission at least slightly, which is probably why that happened. However, these herbs themselves, some of the herbs that would have been in use at the time, have antimicrobial properties. Juniper is a great example. Juniper, which is beloved in parts of Europe, used to flavor gin, of course. All parts of the plant release a volatile oil, which is antimicrobial in nature. Swiss hospitals, as late as the First World War, were highly prized by people for treating their ailments from the battlefield, for treating wounds, because the death rate was mysteriously lower. It then turns out they were largely burning juniper wood, releasing antimicrobial compounds into the room, preventing sepsis. And septicemic plague, again, is another thing that you have to worry about. In septicemic plague, you've got a 100% mortality rate if it's not substantially treated. Anyone who went septicemic in the Dark Ages would have died. There would have been a 0% chance that they would have lived. With pneumonic, it's about 90%, and that strain appears to have been pneumonic more often than other strains. With regular bubonic plague, you're looking at up to 60%. Sometimes lower. It could have been a weaker strain in some of these areas. Only 20 or 30% of the people who got it were dying, and of course it's also possible it was mutating as it went, thus eventually burning itself out and affecting areas disproportionately. Interesting story, at the time the Kingdom of Poland was barely affected by the Black Death. It's possible that a mutated variant preceded the more lethal ones, infected people but didn't cause a high death rate, and thus transferred resistance to the actual Black Death. It is possible. Or it's possible they just didn't get it because they closed their borders. I'm not sure. The plague mask and the plague suit, the sort of the plague doctor outfit that we're all familiar with, sort of a bird beak looking mask and the big brimmed hat and the black robe, black thick robe, and the pointy stick like a wand that people are so familiar with, would have reduced transmission of the disease. By flea, as one vector, the suit angled right into the boots. The fleas would not have been able to penetrate such thick layers of wool and leather. The mask was fastened directly into the hood that was being worn. There was nowhere for a flea to get in. So as far as the fleas went, these people were off limits as long as they were dressed up, and presumably they probably would have slept in their plague suit, because they would have been so worried about getting the plague at the time that they would rather do that than potentially die or get sick with this disease. The suit would have prevented that. It also would have prevented exposure, in the case that it was pneumonic, to the aerosolized droplets carrying the plague bacterium. Wool is hydrophobic. Wool does not transfer liquids easily from one side to the other because it contains lanolin. It's an oil. It's very hydrophobic. In the case where the suit was mostly leather, leather again would be impermeable to these droplets, and of course they were wearing gloves, so if they were touching themselves or anything else, they didn't care. They were completely sealed up in this suit. The mask was a full facial covering angled directly into the woolen hood, almost airtight. The only way for air to get in was through the beak. Now, the way that the beaks are presented usually is as sort of just a prominence sticking off the front of the suit of no real importance. You know, maybe they were trying to scare the boogeyman away or scare away the miasmus. That doesn't seem to be the case. What seems to have been the case is it would curve down, and the ventilation was on the back side of this beak-like appendage. If that's the case, then aerosolized droplets launched at the plague doctor by someone who was dying and coughing up blood probably wouldn't have affected them, because it would have been splattering the front side of the beak. It wouldn't have been going in the back as readily. Further, it was then filtered through wads of these same antimicrobial herbs that are capable of destroying bacteria. These are white, and this sort of technology, because that's what it is, it's an innovation regarding herbal medicine, wasn't just in medieval culture in Europe or North Africa or the Roman provinces, which would have been affected. It was all over the world where herbal medicine is prevalent. White sage comes from the Americas in native lore. White sage releases antimicrobial compounds. Mugwort, which was also used sort of to chase away the demons of sickness. The thing is, the people that lived back then, they didn't understand, they didn't know what a virus was. If you said, oh, you've got a bacteria in your body making you sick, they would have said, what are you talking about? Is bacteria the name of a demon? They didn't know what was causing the sickness, but they still knew how to sort of prevent it. The Pope at the time, one of the Avignon popes in France, because he had fled Rome, actually his court physician said to keep the plague away from the Pope, they should erect these big braziers around the Pope with fire going 24/7, and he should even sleep there. He would have a wall of flame around him. That could have been mildly effective, because anybody who was sick who was talking to the Pope and the plague was pneumonic, essentially they're coughing out these droplets, would have been coughing them through a wall of fire, which would have sterilized them completely and destroyed a large proportion of the plague bacteria that would have otherwise been all over the Pope's robes and face. Even his robe probably would have given him some protection. You've got to understand, the people back then weren't dumb. They didn't understand things that couldn't be seen or smelled or heard, things that they couldn't sense. They would have said it was just a demon. But they still understood the concept of sickness. A lot of the modern medicine comes from that era. Modern hazmat suit looks an awful lot like a plague suit from the 1300s. An awful lot. Modern gas mask looks and functions relatively similar to a plague mask. A lot of the antimicrobials that are used now are essentially chemical versions, artificial variants, more powerful variants of things found in nature and plants. Aspirin comes from the willow tree. They weren't dumb. The ancient Egyptians were performing cranial surgery to relieve pressure from head injuries. They even understood the concept of sanitation. They understood that there were certain locations, they would say they were cursed or full of demons, or the miasmus, which was a foul air infected with a virulence that couldn't be seen. It was an evil presence, sort of like a spirit in the wind that made you sick. Eerily similar to mnemonic theory of plague. They understood that certain locations caused people to become ill. Swamps, which would have been filled with rodents, it would have been a perfect breeding ground for disease. We even understand now that swamps breed disease, mosquitoes and so forth. Sewer systems, areas that are blighted by human waste, they understood this. They weren't completely dumb. We look back at the medieval era and most older times, and we say people back then didn't understand what they were talking about. But these occultists, for that's what they were, these occultists in plague robes and plague masks, were being at least somewhat protected against the plague at the time. They knew what they were doing. And the death rate among plague doctors was lower. The death rate among groups of people who had such practices was measurably lower than other groups of people, and in other cases lower, possibly due to a mutation preceding the main plague, or to a genetic variation in the human population conferring some resistance. There are human beings in the world today that are mildly resistant against the bubonic plague. there are possibly humans that are resistant to Ebola, and those two groups oddly seem to overlap, which is making people go, But no, the people back then largely knew what they were doing. They simply didn't understand the concept of something they couldn't see getting in their body, replicating, and making them sick. Even the idea of lancing the buboes is still practiced today as a standard precaution to prevent septicemic plague from taking hold. In the case where someone has bubonic plague, what can happen? The buboes, the lymph nodes, swell up with the infection. If the pressure is not relieved, it can back up into the bloodstream. Then it becomes virtually universally fatal, even with modern medicine, even with antibacterial treatments, antibiotics and so forth. They would then lance the buboes. They understood that it caused the death rate to be lower. Not a huge amount, it didn't save everybody, but it did help a little. The plague mask and plague suit, it may not have prevented all transmission, it may not have been perfect, but it was better than nothing. It was essentially similar to the modern design of the suits that medical professionals would wear in an Ebola ward. It was similar. Full gloves, full boots, everything is one piece, the mask angles into the hood, it prevents virtually all aerosolized materials from coming into contact with the flesh. It actually probably worked fairly well. People wondered, well, how did the plague doctors avoid getting sick? It doesn't make sense. If you're wearing a suit that is essentially airtight, of course you're not going to get the plague as easily. They might have eaten infected food and gotten the plague anyway. Someone coughs up all over their apples, or their fucking cabbages or turnips or whatever else medieval Europeans were eating on a regular basis. But it would have been better than nothing. Again, the idea of sanitation was understood back then. They didn't know how to go about properly sanitizing all locations. They had a tendency to believe that clear-cutting and burning things was the proper way to go. They were burning the bodies in the streets. They didn't realize that the rats were largely where the plague was coming from. Oddly, around this same time, they were killing off cats because they thought they were evil. If they had left the cats, they probably wouldn't have had as bad a problem, which is one oversight that they didn't make properly. But yes, as far as the occult is concerned, these people back then were not as dumb as we like to believe. We like to think of them as relatively unsophisticated and brutish. But you've got to understand they weren't. They had concepts. They knew architecture. They knew about engineering. They knew about these things. They had alchemy. They didn't have chemistry, but they had alchemy, which is comparable. It's less civilized maybe than what we've got today, but they understood the concepts. And in fact, many of the scientific advances of the time were deliberately couched, and I've explained this about alchemy in particular, they were couched in religious language. The idea of science, the idea of mathematics and steganography and science and so forth would have been considered witchery back then. So if I was a plague doctor or an alchemist or anybody with any intelligence back then, and I wrote a book about these things, I would have classed it as a religious work. I would have been praising Jesus vehemently throughout the entire work, writing in code for my actual true acolytes to understand what I'm talking about, and I would have taught very few people how to read them. And in many cases, this has been lost over time. And then I would have published it as a religious work. It would have been either a sorceress grimoire that, don't worry, it's white magic, it calls on angels, so it's okay at the time for the church. The king wouldn't have had you beheaded as long as you made sure to praise Michael and Carmiel and all of these other figures, rather than black magic, which was what those horrible old women out in the woods that perform abortions do, and they play with their herbs all day. But no, the occultists knew what they were talking about. The wisest people in the medieval era were the old women living on the edges of society who dispensed herbal treatments. And people probably had a better survivorship rate for the average illness going to them than going to what they would have considered a physician back then, who would have drilled a hole in your head and removed a piece of your brain to cure lunacy. That's the sort of thing that the mainstream medical community did from the Renaissance onward, which didn't work. The occultists were the ones that understood medicine. They were compiling works dating to ancient Rome, rewriting them, keeping them alive, and then simply writing in their own steganography so that the king and the church wouldn't realize they were actually talking about principles that would have seemed like witchery at the time. No, the plague doctors had a perfect lid on what was going on. The things that they did worked. to some extent, to the best of their abilities at that time. The plague doctors were well protected compared to their peers, their more religious peers. The flagellants, for example. The flagellants said, well, to cure the plague, we've got to whip ourselves. We've got to take the iniquity of man away. And they would take the whores and put them out in the woods, or beat them, or kill them, or whatever, to get them out of the cities to try to stop the plague. They wouldn't allow bells to toll. They tried all sorts of weird, spooky, superstitious tricks. And they were all the religious Christians. Most of these plague doctors probably were a bunch of pagans. They probably didn't give a shit. They kept up appearances and probably wore a cross anyway. These people were walking around with wands and talking about herbal medicine. That's not found back in the medieval era. That would have been considered witchery. The only reason they weren't executed by the Catholic Church is that the Catholic Church had lost a great deal of favor. People thought it was the end of the world. People stopped going to church for fear of getting sick. There was no money coming into the church largely around that time. For several years, the church would have been considered impoverished compared to what it had been. They wouldn't have been living in luxury. They would have been living in Spartan headquarters that were only half warmed. Because who the hell's going to go out to collect taxes for the church when everybody's keeling over convinced it's the end times? They didn't care. And the rich moved to their retreats out in the countryside, closed the gates with their food stockpiles, and usually got the plague anyway. They wouldn't even let in a plague doctor. And that's the truth. The occultists at the time, during the Middle Ages, were probably better equipped to deal with an outbreak of plague than most of what you would consider court physicians at the time, that would not have had that sort of training. If they did, like the one hired by the Pope who was oddly messing around with magic at the time, then they were probably dabbling in the occult, at least by the church's standards, because those would be the only works they could read that would give them an idea of medicine. They would have been relying upon occult translations of texts from ancient Greece and Rome, from people who had come centuries before. So that's the Occult Video 4 on the plague. I just thought it was a worthy concept to cover. Incidentally, minor news. I bought a new keyboard, so I'll be making new music now that I've got this microphone that works better for that purpose. I was going to do it before, but then I figured out that the keyboard that I have now is broken. Thankfully, Casios are relatively inexpensive, so I bought one. So I'll be making some more. That's about all. Peace out.